After watching this video and taking notes, you should be able to answer these questions. What is kitab, surah, and ayah, plural ayat? Explain the layout of the written Quran. What is the Quranic God like? What do we mean by the names of God? What is Iman and Kufr? Explain how the Quran uses signs, also ayah or ayat. Give some examples of these signs. What is shirk? Who are some of the various groups of people that the Quran discusses? What will happen in the afterlife? Who are the people of the book and the associators? According to Islamic studies, the scientific study of Islam, what does the Quran say? In a certain way, the history of Islam has been the history of reinterpreting the Quran over and over again in lots of different times and places. Throughout this course, we're going to talk about how many different Muslims have approached the Quran, looking for how it's been interpreted consistently and how it's been interpreted differently. We'll discuss what the Quran means to Muslims across Islamic history later. For now, though, we're just going to spend the next two discussions focusing just on what the Quran was saying to its primary audience, the peoples of the late antique Hijaz, who lived in the mostly oral culture of Arabia in the early 7th century. If Islamic studies is all about putting things in historical context, what was the Quran saying to the people who heard it first? Last time, we mentioned that the Quran appeared in Mecca, in the Hijaz region of Arabia, in the period of history that we call late antiquity. As such, the Quran addresses itself to people who are living in that setting. The Quran is in Arabic, not one of the standard literary languages of late antiquity. The Quran is an oral performance, because very few people in late antique Arabia would have had access to books. The Quran is more ethical than legal, because the Quran appeared in a tribal world where interpersonal relationships were everything, and there was no standing government. And the Quran assumes familiarity with the cultures and cults of the Quraysh tribe, specifically paganism, Judaism, and Christianity. When we talk about the Quran in late antiquity, we kind of mean two things at once. First, we mean the series of oral recitations given by a certain man named Muhammad who died in the year 632. What words came out of the mouth of this particular human who lived in a particular locale? Second, when we talk about the Quran, we're talking about the records of Muhammad's recitation, the echoes of Muhammad's ministry, which survive to us in the minds of people who memorized the Quran, and in the texts of the Quran that people later wrote down. So we have this artifact, the written Quran, and we're going to use this artifact to learn what we can about Muhammad, late antique Arabia, and the oral recitations that happened there. The Quran talks about itself quite a bit. It names itself and identifies itself as an oral recital, a Quran. And because it's speaking to an oral society where people memorize everything, it constantly tells its audience to remember. Use your memory. Listen to this. Recall that. When you're in this situation, say such and such. The Quran speaks as if it's speaking to people who have little access to proper literature. But on the other hand, the Quran often calls itself a book, a kitab. Now, this can be a little deceptive because, strictly speaking, the Quran isn't a book. It's a vocal performance, like a chant or a homily. So when the Quran says that it's a kitab, a book, we have to think of this the way people in late antique Arabia would have thought of it. The word kitab literally means something written down, like a book. But it could also mean a letter, or a piece of graffiti, or a note. A kitab is an inscription, something scripted, something written down. Now, to us today, that means a book. And in modern Arabic, that's exactly what a kitab is. It's just the standard word for a book, a bunch of papers between two covers. But books like that, codices, were hardly the norm in 7th century Arabia. So when the Quran calls itself a kitab, what it means to say is that it's something like a record. It's something authoritative, something permanent. Spoken words are ephemeral. You speak some words and then they're gone. But writing lingers on. It freezes words from the past on paper and ink and on stone. So when the Quran says that it's a kitab, a book, a record, it's telling us that these aren't just some fleeting conversational words, but something that moves through time. The way that words on a page or on stone remain long after the author has left or even died. And sure enough, at least some people in Muhammad's own lifetime did start writing down the words of this Quran. How exactly this happened isn't clear, but chances are there were some literate people in the 7th century Hijaz, and a few of them acted as Muhammad's scribes. At some point, and again it's not exactly clear how and when, the notes of these scribes came together to form a proper book, a canon. That is, the ancestor of all the printed Qurans on bookshelves today. If you pick up one of these written Qurans, you're going to notice first that it's rather short. In English, if it's printed, the whole Quran is only about 300 pages long, give or take. If you wanted to, you could read through the entire text in about 2 long sittings. Next, you would see that the Quran is divided up into 114 sections, called surahs. A surah, meaning something enclosed, are kind of like the chapters of the Quran. They're its basic units. But other than the fact that these surahs divide the Quran up, they don't really work like chapters. Remember that the Quran that you are reading is a written version of an oral recitation. It's a transcript. And speech doesn't come in chapters. As such, the surahs of the Quran, like parts of a conversation, vary widely in length, contents, and themes. The surahs of the Quran range from very short to very long, and like a conversation again, they jump around in topic and style as needed. When the Quran was turned into a proper book, the 114 surahs were arranged by their length, not by the chronological order in which they first appeared. In the ancient world, where books didn't have page numbers or tables of contents, an easy way to arrange a lot of different material was just to sort it out by its length. The letters of the Christian New Testament are arranged this way. So are the tractates of the Jewish Mishnah. Those collections, like the written Quran, are arranged by the length of their sections, from the longest to the shortest. So, if you look in a written copy of the Quran today, the longest surahs are towards the front, while the shortest are generally in the back. Although they're not part of the original oral recitations of Muhammad, each of the surahs have one or more names. But again, this doesn't necessarily work like the titles of book chapters, where the titles give you a clue as to what the chapter is actually about. The names of the surahs of the Quran are just a way of referring to them. So, for instance, if you wanted to mention the first surah of the Quran, you could just call it by the name Al-Fatiha, the opening, and you would know that this means to look in the Quran, surah number 1. Now, the names of the surahs aren't consistent. Some of the names of the surahs refer to people who are mentioned in the surahs. So there are surahs of the Quran with names like Joseph, Abraham, or Mary. Other surahs are named after natural phenomena like the thunder, or the iron, or the constellations. And others still are named after a theme that appears within the surah, like the hypocrites, the forgiver, or the Romans. But whatever a given surah is called, don't assume that the name of that particular surah is necessarily going to give you information about what the surah is actually about. All but one of the Quran's 114 surahs begins with an invocation, the Basmalah, which swears, "In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim." Besides just saying these words when you begin reciting one of the surahs of the Quran, traditionally, many Muslims will also recite this before doing other important things, like writing a letter or beginning a speech. There's also a further invocation, which is usually said before reading the Quran aloud. This is the isti'adha, the seeking of refuge. The isti'adha says, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitan ar-rajim." I seek refuge with God from Satan, the accursed. This formula is an act of piety that precedes reciting the Quran, but the formula itself isn't actually written before the texts. The people say this formula because the Quran tells them to. So when you recite the Quran, seek refuge with God from Satan, the accursed. Each of the 114 surahs of the Quran are also subdivided into verses, ayah, or the plural ayat. These verses also vary quite a bit in length and style. But usually, these ayat mark the various rhyme schemes of the Quran. About 85% of the Quran's text rhymes, although there are many different rhyme schemes it uses. But other times, the verses, the ayat, just mark the end of a thought or a story. Some of them read like a whole paragraph. So, most of the time, the verses, the ayat, show us the rhyme scheme of the Quran, but not always. And again, the number of ayat in each surah, each section, is different. Some of the Quran's longer surahs have hundreds of these verses. Some just have a few dozen, while others have just 3 or 4. These ayat, as well as the surahs, are also how we cite the Quran today. So, for example, when you see Quran 4:38, that means the 38th ayah of the 4th surah of the Quran. All that said, what is the Quran actually about then? Well, in a word, God. When the Quran invokes God, the people of the original late antique audience would have understood this to mean the biblical God of the Jews and Christians. Unlike in English, the Arabic word Allah, literally the God, is clearly distinct from other gods like those that pagans would have. So, in English, you could say, so-and-so worshipped a god, and it's not clear which god that means. Well, in Arabic, Allah only refers to the one God of the ancient Hebrews and the later Jews and Christians. And what's the feature of that God? It is one, unique, and it has no equal or other gods. There's no other being whose power matches God. There are no other gods. So worship God alone. Your God is one God. There is no God but Him. Imagine if you were a late antique Jew or Christian who somehow knew this line from the prophet Isaiah: I am the Lord. There is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. Well, the God of the Quran would sound very, very familiar to you. Indeed, I am God. There is no God but me. So, when the first audience heard the Quran, they would not have thought that this was some new God they never heard of before. This was a God they knew of already, and some people in the audience already worshipped it. And this God wanted nothing to do with any rivals, partners, or other gods. The God of Muhammad, that is, the God of the Jews and the Christians, was a God of monotheism. This God is one. However, if there's only one God, and it's a God of everything and everyone, this God must have a variety of powers and functions. If you're a polytheistic pagan, that means you have a lot of gods. You have a god of the sea, a god who made the world, a fertility god, and so on. But this one God of the Quran is the only God of everywhere and everything. It has all the possible powers that one would attribute to a god. And thus, the Quranic God has a huge variety of names and titles. We've already met a few of them in the Basmala. God is Allah, the God, Ar-Rahman, the merciful, Ar-Rahim, the compassionate. But the Quranic God has even more names. This God is Al-Musawwir, the designer, Al-Ghaffar, the forgiving, Al-Razaq, the provider, Al-Latif, the gentle, Al-Haq, the truth, Al-Wali, the friend, Al-Muhyi, the bringer of life, Al-Mumit, the bringer of death. And this list of the names used for God in the Quran goes on and on and on. Traditionally, names and roles like these are referred to as Al-Isma al-Husna, the most beautiful names, based on several verses, ayat, of the Quran that tell us to him, that is to God, belong the most beautiful names. Now, while the Quran never tells us how many of these names God actually has, later stories attributed to Muhammad tell us that there are 99 names of God. Some people have taken this number literally and tried to create lists of 99 different names that God uses in the Quran, while some other people have taken it more symbolically as a number that suggests great plenty and abundance. And just as the God of the Quran is one, but has many, many names, so too does the God of the Quran have multiple pronouns. Sometimes, God is the narrator of the Quran, and so God is I or me. Other times, God is being spoken about in the third person, as he or it, which are both the same word in Arabic. Still other times, God uses the royal we, speaking of itself in the plural, the way monarchs often do. And God will switch pronouns across the Quran, even in the same sections. So just within a few moments, God may be the singular I, the distant he, and the magisterial we. This endless pronoun shifting creates a feeling of a deity who observes its creation from multiple angles and points of view all at once. This God is afar, nearby, within creation, and yet like a ruler enthroned high above the world. Because the Quranic God is the only God, it asks the listener to have faith or belief. This word is iman. Now, this term can get a little tricky because when we today mention having faith in God or believing in God, what we mean is to have faith in the existence of something, to believe that it is. For us, the opposite of someone who believes in God is an atheist, someone who thinks that God does not exist. But when the Quran and pretty much all ancient texts mention having faith or belief, in this case iman, they aren't supposing a proposition that you should accept, like that God exists, but instead how you should act. To have iman, belief, is to behave in such a way that shows that you trust in God. It's much more like in English when we say, I have faith in her, or I believe in her. You aren't really saying, I think she exists, but instead, I will do right by her and I expect that she'll do right. Remember the word deen. It means debt or repayment. You do something and then your God will do something in return. You'll get what you're owed. Well, this is iman. It's to have faith or believe that if you do certain things, God will act accordingly. So the opposite of iman isn't atheism in the modern sense. Actually, the Quran never really entertains that some people might just believe that God doesn't exist. Instead, the Quran thinks that some people will not act in accord with God and do what they're supposed to do. Now remember, the intended audience of the Quran in late antique Arabia already knows about this one God. So the opposite of iman isn't atheism, but covering up or hiding the truth, kufr. Kufr is the state of doing things that conceal the nature of God and conceal the debt that people owe to this divine being. Kufr is often translated in English as unbelief, but that can be a little bit misleading. Because unbelief is to accept something is not true, while kufr is to act as if something isn't true, even though you know better already. Kufr is to know about God and what God demands of you, but to live for yourself instead. So how do people know about God already, even before the Quran appeared? Remember that this is a God of wahi, a God who communicates with the world that it's created. This God expresses itself in various ways. These expressions of God are called signs, again using the word ayah with the plural ayat, the same word used to describe the verses of the Quran. When we say something is a sign, what we mean is it's an object, word, or event that refers to something else. When you see a red sign and it says stop on it, that sign is referring to an action or law that you are to follow. It's referring to something that's otherwise invisible, that is, that you're supposed to stop there. When you see the sign, you act accordingly. Well, that's how the God of the Quran works. God sends various sorts of signs to humanity. Some of these are words, like the verses of the Quran. Others are people, stories, or events that are to remind people of God and God's power. And others still are signs in the natural world that signify God as the creator and controller of all things. And that also means that the Quran is saying you don't need new information to see and understand God. You have signs of God all around you. We shall show them our signs in the horizons and in themselves, until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. The world around us is composed of ayat, signs. Animals and plants, the sun and the moon, the stars and the mountains, the seas and the earth. There is no reason, using the Quran's logic, not to know about God, as God's signs are everywhere. And God has sent revealed texts to humans to make the point even more plain. Revelations like the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospel all come from God, and they remind various people to remember the oneness of God and worship that God just as they ought to. Again, the Quran is a reminder of what you know already, not just new information. Surely it, that is the Quran, is descending from the Lord of the worlds. The trustworthy Spirit has brought it down upon your heart so that you may be one of the warners in a clarifying Arabic language. Surely it is indeed in the scriptures of the old ones. Was it not a sign for them that was known to the learned of the tribes of Israel? And beyond just the texts of revelation from God, God has also sent prophets and messengers to people across history to tell them to turn back to God and to have iman, faith. There are more than 20 different prophets mentioned in the Quran, including biblical figures like Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. There are also other prophets like Saleh and Hud, who seem to have been known in Arabia specifically, but don't appear in any Jewish or Christian literature that we know of. And the Quran alludes to many, many other people who God has also sent, but doesn't name them, suggesting that there have been multitudes of messengers and prophets. We have raised up in every community a messenger, saying, "Serve God." And again, why all the prophets and messengers? To act as signs, to remind people what they know already from nature, from other texts, and from other prophets, that God is one and deserves to be worshipped as such. The problem is, do people read the signs correctly? You're supposed to see a sign and then behave as it indicates. But if you incorrectly read a sign, you won't take it as a reference to something else, but instead as a reference to itself. Think of the stop sign again. It would be like seeing a red stop sign, and rather than stopping your car or bicycle, it would be like treating the sign as a piece of art, as if the stop sign exists for its own sake. If you do this, you have failed to understand that this sign is an object of reference to something else besides itself. So, when it comes to the signs, the ayat of the Quranic God, that is, all the words and stories, people, events, miracles, and natural wonders that God has sent to the human race to remind them of God, well, the Quran is concerned that people confuse all these things with gods themselves. So, it'd be like looking at the sun, and instead of seeing it as a sign of the powerful God who made it, it would be thinking that the sun is itself a god, like a sun god. The Quran calls this shirk, association. It basically is the Quran's ultimate sin and the root of all evil. Shirk, association, is to look at a created thing, like nature, and attribute to it divine status. To treat something God made or sent as if it's a god itself. That is, to associate a thing with God. But no, even though God has many names and sends many signs, God is still one and without equal. Other gods aren't gods at all. People aren't gods. Wealth isn't a god. And you aren't a god. And so it is the sin of shirk to treat these things as if they're gods. The Quran isn't that interested in tribal affiliation or ethnic groups. Who cares what group you were born into? The real questions are, how do you act? How do you think? How do you treat God? And how do you treat other people? So instead of dwelling on family groups, the Quran instead divides up the human race based on how they respond to God and God's ayat. The best group to be in is the mu'minun, the believers. Literally, the ones who have iman, belief, faith, trust in God. These are the people who remember God in their prayers and thoughts and act virtuously towards one another, most especially towards those people in need. Now, It seems that during the career of Muhammad, when the Quran was appearing, the word Muslim, a submitter to God, wasn't used that often. The word believer appears many, many more times in the Quran than the word Muslim does. In fact, it's not until near the end of Muhammad's life that we start to see Quranic passages that say the name of this proper belief, this deen, is Islam, submission. Today, those who disbelieve have no hope of ever destroying your deen. So do not fear them, but fear me. Today I have perfected your deen for you. I have completed my blessing upon you, and I have approved submission, Islam, as your deen. After the believers, and somewhat overlapping with them, are other people who have received messages from God, namely Jews and Christians. The Quran calls them the Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book. That is, people who have had access to Wahi, divine communication. However, the Quran also explains that not all of these people of the book are obeying God either. Remember, the Quran doesn't just care that you were born into a certain group. You actually have to behave in certain ways towards God and other humans. So there are some Jews and Christians who have trust in God, but others who don't. They are not all alike. Among the people of the book, there is a community which is upstanding. They recite the signs, ayat of God, during the hours of the night, and they prostrate themselves. They believe in God and the last day. They command the right and forbid the wrong and are quick to do good deeds. Those are amongst the righteous. And then, there are also people who are just plain wicked. That is, the ones who commit shirk, the ones who treat themselves and other created things as gods when they're not. The Quran calls them mushrikun, associators. We might say idolaters. People who think that there are many gods, or behave as if a mere creation of God is God itself. The Quran also refers to them as unbelievers, kafirun, people who commit kufr. While unbelievers is the standard translation of kafirun, think of it more like concealers, people who hide the truth. Someone who knows what they're supposed to know and do, but doesn't do it anyway. The Quran repeatedly asserts that people were made different by God on purpose. God has deliberately sent lots of signs, lots of prophets, and lots of revealed texts, and people haven't always reacted to them the same way. Therefore, rather than wasting your time worrying about which group you're born into, you should try to invest yourself in a kind of friendly contest at outdoing other people with good deeds. And then someday, God will explain why people were all made different. For each of you, we have made a pathway and an open road. If God had so pleased, He could have made you one community, but He did not, in order to test you by what He's given you. So race towards doing good deeds. Your return is to God, all of you, and then He'll inform you about your differences. So, what is this return to God? Life in this world is not the only thing the Quran is concerned about. The Quran is not only a reminder, that is, to remember God and act morally, but it's a warning of a coming day of judgment. The Quran is heavily invested in the afterlife, which it variously refers to as the hour, as-sa'ah, the return, al-ma'ad, and the Yawm ad-Din, the day of repayment for one's deeds and misdeeds. First, like in many of the biblical legends, there will be a general resurrection from the dead, al-Qiyamah, the standing up, the reanimation of everyone who's ever died. People will be returned to their physical bodies, which God will miraculously reconstruct from dust, blood, bone, and particles. God made people this way once before, and in the future, God will do it again. Then, after this resurrection from the dead, people will be judged for their deeds. The virtuous will be granted access to Al-Jannah, the garden, a paradise of comforts and luxuries, marked by beautiful attendants, lush greenery, and flowing rivers. By the way, do not think of the garden as heaven. I know it's normal for Christians and Muslims, and sometimes Jews, to refer to a comforting place in the afterlife as heaven, like a place in the clouds. But the Quran, and for that matter, the Bible, never say that dead people go to live in the clouds. Instead, this garden is an earthly paradise, where people have bodies, food, drinks, sex, beds, and clothing. Those who are not found worthy for entrance into the garden are cast into the fire, an-nar, or hell, Jahannam. There, they will be punished for their cruelty to the needy and their forgetfulness of God and His many signs. Next time, we'll continue this discussion of the Quran by taking a look at the stories that the Quran tells of its various peoples, prophets, angels, and spirits. In the meantime, answer these questions for class thoroughly and in your own words. What is kitab, surah, and ayah, plural ayat? Explain the layout of the written Quran. What is the Quranic God like? What are the names of God? What is Iman and Kufr? Explain how the Quran uses signs, also called ayah or ayat. Give some examples of these. What is shirk? Who are the various groups of people that the Quran discusses? What will happen to people in the afterlife? Who are the people of the book and the associators?